Good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 96. We got a radical proposal for you tonight on how to solve our housing crisis from Alex Vezina, who is CEO of Prepared Canada, emergency preparedness company. Very smart guy. He writes a column every week in the Toronto Sun, and he's published two, part one and part two, on his radical proposal to solve the housing crisis. And it's pretty radical. Alex, what's your proposal? Tell me about it.
Okay, so I want to start off and context this and say that this is the byproduct of where many of the best ideas come from, which is you're in the shower. And then after that, you do some member checking. So just before we get into this, it's going to sound out of this world, and I know how it's going to sound. And I had the same double take with myself on this, where I said, this can't work. And then I asked some people that I, in this space that I trust the opinion of, and they had the same opinion. There's no way this can work. And then they called me back a day later and they said, actually, we think you're a genius. This actually could work. So I'm going to caveat all that, saying that this brings in a lot of different fields, as anything with the housing crisis would, because it's a very complicated problem. And just suspend your disbelief for a few minutes, because there's a lot of caveats in here.
Okay, so you make charging rent illegal.
Okay, so there's three parts of this. So I'll just give the three main pieces of it. The first is you basically remove the charging of rent from the equation entirely. Now you have to replace that with something. So it's a fairly simple idea with very, very complex effects and implications. So you remove rent from the equation entirely. So you have to make renting illegal so that market essentially does not exist. You then replace that market with essentially a stipend provided to landowners from the government on a per resident basis. So landowners are paid for providing the service of housing residents with zero restriction. So if you house yourself, you're paid for housing yourself. You simply place a value on housing a resident. Now, the third part, which is very important to maximize market mobility, is that stipend has to be a set number that does not have any variance across all jurisdictions. So the stipend for housing somebody in a small town in Nunavut is the same as the stipend in downtown Toronto. And it's critical to the whole model. And there's a lot of questions that come off of all of these, but that one alone. But because you're equalizing the value of housing an individual, you create maximum market mobility, and market forces essentially just solve everything. So market forces with that combined basically fix everything. And I've gotten a lot of questions on this about how would housing agreements work? How do I get rid of a problem tenant? Things like that. And the answer ends up becoming, you just keep what we do now. With most of it, you still have agreements. If someone is destroying your property, doing property damage, and they're paying their rent, it's the same as in this system, except now the rent is essentially guaranteed.
A house in Rosedale versus a house in Mississauga versus a house in Owen Sound cost a whole different amount of money. Why would the stipend be the exact same? Because you're
decoupling housing a resident from the value of a house entirely.
But how does the value of the house get reflected in anything other than the rent or the stipend that you can earn?
By the number of people that are willing to live there in terms of density. So
if I've got a mansion in Rosedale and there's only two people living in there, I'm never going to get the value out of the house.
You're right. Then you should probably put more people in that mansion.
Okay. And so what's going to happen is all the mansions that are or the Toronto houses that aren't densely populated are going to dramatically reduce in value, and the houses in Owen Sound are going to go up in value.
Unless people decide that they want to move in there. Like, think from this perspective here. They're just going to create agreements where they want more people to live in the house.
Okay, so how does this solve the problem?
Because people move to where they can live. I don't understand the issue.
No, you're paying a stipend. So let's say the stipend is $1,000 a month per person.
Well, the magic number is actually pretty important here, because it has to be high enough to incentivize landowners to want to use the system, low enough to not bankrupt the country. And there's a few different limits here. So if there is no magic number, it doesn't work. Like, the whole model kind of works around the magic number, right? But sorry, finish the rest of your question.
I want to understand how your solution solves the housing crisis.
You're creating a system where it becomes a race to the top to get people in as dense of housing as possible. because the tenant or the resident, really, you don't really have tenants anymore in this sort of system, is able to move with so much more mobility, they simply move to better accommodations, and there becomes direct competition between every landowner on what the most attractive accommodations are. People, like, for example, let's say someone wants to live in downtown Toronto. What will likely happen in the system is the person who wants to live in downtown Toronto might be forced into a situation where they would have to basically put 7 people in a 1-bedroom apartment. They won't like that. So in similar value, they'll be able to go live in a large house in a small town, and people move away. This then forces people to make the living accommodations in Toronto more attractive because people want to naturally move out. If all value is the same and people want to move to a small town, then we should be moving people to a small town. The reverse could also be true. It doesn't really matter where they go, but you simply let the market forces do what they need to do, because you're giving the resident market mobility that they don't otherwise have.
But don't they have that market mobility today?
No.
Why?
I think all of the evidence based on housing prices, rent, and unlivability in this country is evident of that, and arguing against that is, I think the statement of no is so evident it doesn't even have to be proven.
No, I disagree with you. I think that if what you're saying is that if a resident is worth $500 or $1,000, whatever it is, that stipend a month, the market is going to build more housing. Well, you know what? They're paying $2,000 or $2,500 a month for a 500 square foot apartment in downtown Toronto, and we have more cranes in downtown Toronto than any other city in North America, and still we're not building enough housing. And the reason why we're not building enough housing is because I believe that municipal governments are slow, and the CMHC has said this, Stats Canada said this, Build has said this, that municipal governments are slow to approve housing. And so it's not the market forces that are a problem. We have market forces. The problem is regulatory impediments to building them and the time it takes to get approvals.
So I think those are two different issues. They do relate, of course, and I don't disagree on the issues of supply and demand in housing. In fact, I've written articles on that where I agree that there are obviously issues in supply and demand in housing. The idea with this radical proposal, though, or the idea behind it, was that you still get more optimal mobility of people within the same system. They can simply move. And you remove the expense, the cost of living expense, which for people in, I'd say, when you look at the median and below of Canadians is more than 50% of their household expenditure, you take it off the board. You're removing the cost of living, you're taking cost of living and you're cutting it in half. And then
this becomes, the biggest new expenditure for the federal government. How does the federal government afford it?
There's many different answers to that. I had a few, and then I actually had a bunch that were given to me that I thought were better than the ideas that I had. When you look at the reduce in cost to the government from basically fixing housing, you save a ridiculous amount of money in social assistance. You save a ridiculous amount of money in healthcare, specifically with frequent flyers, because you effectively fix homelessness. So you deal with that problem immediately, because every homeless person represents a paycheck now, and someone's going to build accommodations somewhere and want to house them. So you have so many cost savings, and you have a fair amount of bureaucratic savings too, because you don't need the same level of social assistance anymore, that it by and large pays for itself. But even if it doesn't, and I'm gonna go down one realm, which I don't necessarily agree with doing this, but you could theoretically do this. Because you're reducing the cost of living for most Canadians by more than 50%, you could increase income tax by 30% and it wouldn't matter. Like you're reducing the cost of living of most of the country by a massive amount. You're more than doubling, even with a 50% income tax increase, you're more than doubling people's disposable income, and you're not paying the resident. You're paying the landowner. So you don't have the problem where the resident collects a check and then doesn't pay their rent. So, which is a serious concern. And this is one of the major concerns that you get with people who argue against GAI, that it doesn't incentivize labor. In this case, they still have to eat, they still have to make money, because you're not paying the resident. You're just removing the expense and you're paying the landowner directly. You're also decreasing the risk on the landowner because their rent is guaranteed. If your tenant cannot choose to not pay the rent, it's being given to you. So now housing investment is lower risk. Like, there's a lot here. And it's once again, simple idea with really complicated effects. I see the wheels turning a bit. I see there's a bit of you're nuts, but there's also maybe.
I think you are nuts, but let me tell you, I do think there's some truth in your suggestion in some ways, and I'll give you one fact that you're probably well aware of. Actually, homelessness went down, and housing poverty went down during COVID because of CERB. And so what ended up happening is we effectively had a test run of a guaranteed annual income for a couple of years during COVID-19, because we had these, significant payments that were coming out of the federal government to individuals. And what CMHC and housing experts found, and I interviewed a housing expert just on this past week, was that people ended up taking some of that and a significant amount of that CERB money and spending on housing. And we ended up having the biggest reduction in housing need for low-income people in the last couple of decades, since major programs coming out of the 1960s and 1970s. And so what it says is that having a guaranteed annual income of some amount, and that would be comparable to your $500 or $1,000 a month stipend for housing, ends up being spent on housing, and dramatically reduces homelessness, mental health issues, et cetera. So I think there is some potential truth in what you're saying, which is the benefit of getting people off the streets, getting people out of inadequate housing, getting them into housing. Anyway, we got to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Alex Vezina, CEO of Prepared Canada, talking about his radical housing solution that's been published the last 2 weeks in the Toronto Sun. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with Alex Vezina tonight, CEO of Prepared Canada, emergency preparedness company, and he's taken a look at our housing crisis. And he's come up with a pretty radical solution that he's published columns on in the Toronto Sun for the last 2 weeks. And it's kind of interesting because what he's suggesting is what we should do is we should have the federal government pay a monthly stipend to landowners for housing residents, people that own the houses as well as everybody else, as an incentive to get the market to build more housing. Alex, right now, we have people wanting to buy, people wanting to rent. We've got the lowest vacancy rate in history, and we've got huge housing demand and housing inaffordability. Why isn't the market working now?
Few things there. So the first, on the idea being proposed, another critical part of this is market mobility and the stipend being a set rate. The idea completely changes if you have a variable stipend. And there's a big part of it around market mobility, and there's a lot there. Your question as to why isn't the market working now? There are many answers to that. I don't think that I can give a fulsome answer that would be sufficient. I've written on this in 2 separate pieces that are not the pieces involving the radical solution. And generally what I've alluded to is there's issues on the demand side, there's issues on the supply side. One of the biggest issues we have is we don't have enough houses. Another big issue that we have is market speculation has kind of gotten out of control. And we also have significant issue with money laundering being done through our housing market from criminal organizations internationally, and that being a significant contributor to our GDP. So there's a lot going in there, and each one of those needs significantly more detail. And I'm not sure if I can provide you the amount of detail that you're going to want to answer each one of those.
Okay. So I'll give you my point of view on the topic and let you respond. So I think that demand is not the problem. And I think that way too often in the last couple of years, governments and policymakers and political people, et cetera, have come up with solutions from the demand side. And we've had this vacant unit tax. We've had this the foreign buyers tax or restrictions. We've had a whole bunch of things that have been trying to dampen demand, and I don't think it's had any impact because the demand is there and the demand is huge. What we haven't had until very recently is impact on supply. Back after World War II, the federal government had a very major program in making housing available for all the returning vets. And it worked. And we built a lot of housing. In the 1960s, the federal government had a fairly major housing program where they spent a ton of money in building homes, and we increased supply, and it worked. I think what we've done in the last decade, 2 decades, is we've had very little, if not any, government action to increase supply. And what we've had is massive government action to restrict supply. And as I mentioned earlier, CMHC, Build, I think the current Ontario provincial government, Stats Canada, et cetera, have all come out saying the biggest problem is lack of supply. And the lack of supply is there not because we don't have enough land, not because we don't have enough air above land that we could build apartments in or condominiums, but it's because municipal governments have restricted supply dramatically, and they've restricted supply and density because of NIMBYism. And so therefore, because of government red tape and regulations that number one, puts a whole bunch of regulatory impediments and restrictions on developers. And number two, a huge time frame to get approvals, such that it takes longer, sometimes, if not a lot of times, twice as long to get developments approved as it does to actually build them. You end up creating a huge amount of tax and restrictions on supply. And I think this is the same as, any kind of queuing system, supply marketing system that's ever been in place. And the best example being, Soviet Union, where they restricted supply and they created huge lineups. And what ended up happening is the whole thing broke down. What we got to do is we got to allow the market to work. And the way you got to make the market work is when you've got demand that changes on a daily by minute basis, you got to allow supply, and supply can never change on a minute by minute basis. But if we take away the restrictions, supply can react far more quickly. And I think that's the problem. I think the problem in Canada today is lack of supply, and the lack of supply is because of government restrictions. I interviewed a really smart gentleman who works with the Harvard Growth Labs, who said that the problem is primarily in English-speaking common law countries, where we have this attitude in our common law that allows everyone to object. And when you have an attitude in your governance structure that allows everyone to object, you end up having NIMBYism, and you end up slowing down housing development. And in most European countries, we don't have this problem. And one of the reasons why is you don't have the ability to object to your neighbor's right. And when you think about it, if it's your own private property, you should have the right to do with that private property what you want. But what we've created is a system in Canada, a system in the United States, system in England, system in Australia, where you've got a huge amount of right in common law to have issue as to what your neighbor's doing, and question whether they can build a quadplex or a nanny suite or an apartment building or something that shadows you, or et cetera. And in reality, what we have is a system where your private property really isn't your own property. It's influenced to a great degree by what your government, your neighbors, and your society says about that property. More so in real estate than almost any other area of our society.
Okay, so in general, I'm inclined to. So when I talked about the different things that I think contribute to this, I didn't give you the weights for each. I tend to agree with the idea that the supply side is probably the bigger part of the problem. However, tying this into specifically what's happening with municipal governments and NIMBYism, there were quite a few claims that you just made in there, or I shouldn't say that you just made. There were quite a few claims that were made where I think I would need quite a bit of time to verify the evidence to figure out if I agree or disagree. And I don't think this is the right form for us to do that. It would take
so I'll point you to a CMHC.
No, I don't. It's going to take too much time. I'm going to have to read. I'm going to have to verify it. It's a waste of your time. Let's not waste your time. You can point me to it after, and
CMHC and StatsCan just a couple of weeks ago released a major report that said that number one, the time to get approvals was the biggest impact on lack of housing, and number two was regulatory red tape. And I'll point you to that. And so, I think most people, and you take a look at the Ontario provincial government, you take a look at the BC provincial government, for the first time, they're actually trying to have an impact on this. And local governments are objecting dramatically. And you take a look at the Globe and Mail and their articles just this past week, they've been saying effectively this, that, you've got provincial governments that for the first time in history are actually trying to speed up approval, to take away the tax of development charges away from new home builders, or frankly, the GST, which is charged on new home construction, where you don't have an input tax credit, unlike any other industry, and increase housing. But municipal governments are objecting to it every way they can.
But you're pointing to multiple different things that are different. There's premises here that are not being really justified out. And I'm not saying that this is a problem. No, listen. I'm not saying that this is a problem with you. I'm saying that this is something where I would need to take the time and look through each so that we can do that. And pointing me to one thing.
So last year, the Ontario government had
I need to read it, Brian. If you tell me it isn't verified. So I need to take the time and read it. It is impossible for this to be discussed really this way, because I'm not reading it.
Okay, so last year, the Affordable Housing Task Force for the provincial government came forward with 57 recommendations.
Okay, I need to read it though.
I will send this to you. 57 recommendations. They implemented about 5 of them in the housing plan before the provincial election, and they've implemented a couple more with Bill 109, Bill 23, et cetera, that have come out since. Not all, but most trying to impact supply. And to decrease the taxation on supply that municipal governments put in place. And I think that is the issue, that supply is the issue. That said, I interviewed a really interesting person just a couple of days ago that is a housing expert from Ottawa University, University of Ottawa. And it was interesting what her comment was: all those things help general housing supply, and therefore will potentially impact general housing affordability, which is clearly critically important to people like you, because the biggest problem about general housing affordability are young people that want to buy a house or rent an apartment, or newcomers or renters that want to get out of the rental pool and get into the housing market, the ownership market. But it doesn't address, she would argue, social housing. And housing for homeless people, and housing for refugees and new immigrants. And she would argue that the only solution for that 5-10% of the people at the lower income levels is almost what you're describing, which is comparable to CERB, which is a different, guaranteed. And she would argue that the guaranteed annual income that we had from CERB during COVID-19 is one of the best proofs that when given the opportunity of a little bit of extra money, people will get a good house, will get a good place to live. Because after food and water, one of the rights that people want, one of the things that people want desperately, is a place to live. Now, what you're suggesting, I think, goes one step farther, which is the payment actually goes to the landlord. It doesn't actually go to the person who gets to choose what they spend it on, which is the way a guaranteed annual income or CERB worked. It would actually go to the landowner in a payment, a stipend for the rental accommodation, for the housing accommodation. That, I think, is actually a really interesting idea and make a lot of sense. Anyway, we got to take another break for some messages and come back with Alex Vezina in 2 minutes talking about the housing crisis. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. Chatting tonight with Alex Vezina, a columnist in the Toronto Sun, who's put forward a really radical idea for dealing with our housing crisis, which is to provide the federal government to provide a stipend to landowners for every individual that they house, and this, he thinks, would solve our housing crisis. I've debated him during the last segment that I think that that really is attacking the demand side of things, and I think that really what needs to be attacked is the supply side of things. And CMHC and Stats Can and Build and the Ontario government, the BC government, I think, are focused on that right now. But the federal government has an obligation to sort of deal with supply. from a housing standpoint. There's been a big debate lately about what the priority of the federal government should be and could be. And the federal government spends something like $19 billion a year on housing. And some people are arguing it's poorly spent. So, Alex, how would you have the federal government, through your system, increase supply?
Okay, so there's a few things I want to caveat, and then I'll answer that question. First, I'm not actually saying that we should do this. I'm saying that we should have a serious look at this. Because making the claim that you had an idea that you talked to a few experts about and it sounded good and we should suddenly implement something and overhaul the entire system is irresponsible at best. My argument is that if it has merit, we should look at it and see what parts, if it works entirely, or parts we should take from it and think about it, right? Which is the importance of conversations like this. But that's essentially my argument. That's one thing. The second thing, there is, and this has to do with implementation, which sort of relates to the supply part of this. The really interesting thing about this is when you set a value on housing a resident and it's a set exact value, everyone competes. So one behavior that will likely occur from this is municipalities will create contracts to get developers to build mass municipal housing that are more attractive than private housing because they'll want to collect the revenue from the federal government. Because they'll want to, the municipality will want to get paid for housing residents, and they'll want to compete with the private sector. And people will choose if they want to live in private or public housing based on how attractive the housing is, because they can move. So their market forces may result in less red tape simply through wanting to collect more money. So there's a lot of interesting parts of this.
Yeah, you know, I wish you were right. And again,
well, I think I might be, I might not be. That's why I'm saying we should look at it.
Yeah. So right now, provincial governments, municipal governments have the right to build social housing, and they'll get paid for it because people do get welfare or other kinds of monies, and they could earn it. There has been a dearth of social housing built in the last decade. And again, study after study has suggested the biggest reason why is because electors don't want that housing in their neighborhood, and they have influence on the local city municipal politicians, and so therefore the local city municipal politicians don't end up building it. And that's been, you know, Olivia Chow, the new mayor of Toronto's big policy is that we need to build more of that housing, and she's going to not listen to the NIMBYs and get it built.
There is also the argument, which sounds conspiratorial, but is an interesting argument nonetheless, that it is a problem if 80+% of your elected officials are landlords, that they don't tend to act in the interest of the tenant. And the follow-up to that, which I do mention in a few columns, is that the thing is in Canada, once you get a bit rich, the most low-risk business you can really get into to grow your money is owning property. So this isn't the fault of, you know, the rich. This isn't the fault of elected officials, but it stands to reason if you're going to make the amount of money that you make to get elected, you probably are a landlord.
Yeah,
so,
no, I don't think
so. Like that ends up creating a potential conflict of interest problem.
I do think it's a conflict of interest, and I'm not sure it's because they're a landlord. I think it's because they're a landowner or a property owner. And I think that one of the biggest
well, most of them are actually landlords specifically. They're not just property owners. This has been verified.
I think the problem is that our turnout in municipal elections is incredibly low, and the people that vote are older and are typically homeowners. Younger tenants don't tend to vote. And so therefore, I fear that our municipal politicians too often do what they, you know, our incentive system is set up for them to do. They cater to the older landowner rather than the younger tenant. One of my best friends was a tenant activist running in a in Yonge Eglinton area where there were a whole bunch of young tenants, and turnout amongst young tenants was dismal, and the turnout on the property owners was high, and he lost the election. And even though he was president of the local tenants association, very active within that tenant association, ran on a policy of tenant rights. And so I do think that one of the problems we've got is we end up setting up a system of incentives that elected officials want to get elected, and they to get elected end up having to cater to the people that go to the polls. And the people who go to the polls are people that tend to look like me, not like you. And they're older and they're landowners and they've built up a huge net worth in their house. And the last thing they want is for a huge increase in supply. So affordability becomes greater. More people can start buying, but that means that housing prices go down. And I've lost some of my net worth.
I would argue, going off of your point there, and this is without, verifying it too hard or thinking too hard about it, but just off the cuff, I would probably argue that if everybody in Canada who was eligible to vote voted, and my idea ran as you never have to pay rent again, they would get elected on it, they would do it, and it would probably be done recklessly if everyone could vote. Because when you look at the number of Canadians where cost of living and housing is the most important issue, almost to the point of being a single issue voter, if they could hear that they would never have to pay rent again, that would be it. But they don't vote. So on that part, I agree with you.
But everyone can vote. So how do you get them to vote?
Well, that's a great question. I'm sure we can listen to 30 experts that have no idea how to do it, even though it's their field.
So
if we had an answer to that question, we probably wouldn't have the same problems we have in democracies.
I do think that in the last mayoralty election in Toronto, turnout was terrible, but it was higher than it was in the general election that just happened, a year ago. And I think one of the reasons why was that Olivia Chow really did appeal to people that were interested in more housing and housing for people at the lower end of the income scale. And a lot of other people had only addressed issues from a general standpoint, general levels of affordability. And I think that we've got these two dual issues: is how do we make housing more affordable for everyone? But then also, if we don't want to have a Manhattanization of Toronto, how do you make housing available for the people at the lower end of the income spectrum? And we've seen it in droves recently with refugees protesting on street corners in Toronto, and homelessness on the rise like we've never seen it before. And I think the only way you do that is through some sort of monies from the federal, provincial, municipal governments, the way that you've described. Maybe not exactly the way that you've described, but somehow
let's explore this for a second, though. If you did what I'm talking about, if we did what I'm talking about here, everyone would be housed. They would be in population in certain areas. The density would be so high they wouldn't like the living conditions, but they would be housed.
Yeah, you see, I disagree with you, and the reason why is supply.
No. They would cram 10 people in a one-person apartment.
Yeah, but you can't do that. You can't do that.
Yes, you can.
Again, no, you can't, because again, our government regulations, our municipal regulations won't allow it.
Well, you have limitations on fire code, but there is some mansion somewhere where people will be crammed in. We have the space.
You can't.
We have the space.
People that own mansions aren't going to put people in every single room for whatever your stipend is. Your economics, we have the demand today. The problem is supply. We have the demand.
Yes, wait. Yes, they would. Why would you not? If you're renting out a mansion that you don't live in, and the rate is the rate, and you're forced at whatever the rate is, if it's 1,000 per person, 500, whatever it is, if it's 1,000 per person, you're going to put as many people. No. You're going to put as many people as you can possibly cram into that thing, as long as you don't break fire code, and as long as they're willing to agree to it.
No,
are you kidding me?
Someone that owns a mansion in Rosedale,
sure,
where there are 2 people living in it.
Yeah.
They don't want to have 15 other people living in it.
They do if it's going from $2,000 a month to $15,000 a month. You don't have private rent anymore. It's illegal. You supply the market forces of set rate for everybody change all the behavior.
But you're not going to, you can house people for $1,000 in Owen Sound. So you want to have one rate across the country. How are you going to have a rate that is an incentive for a mansion owner in Rosedale to actually have someone move into his second bedroom?
It's $1,000. I don't understand the issue here. What's the question?
People buy housing because they want to live in it, not because they want to run a rooming house.
If you want to live in a house and not play with the market, buy it. Otherwise, you're a renter, and we give you a place to live. And you can choose to move whenever you want and make an agreement.
These people own the homes, And
Yeah.
they are now going to get your stipend from the federal government in addition to their ownership of their home, and they're going to enjoy living there, and they're not going to invite 15 other people to live in their home.
Great. And somebody else will, because it's money.
No, people have money today. People are desperately interested in renting accommodation and buying accommodation today, and they can't do it because supply doesn't exist.
Okay, I think you and I have we have different baseline philosophies on people's fundamental level of greed. So I think we're arguing from different positions philosophically, where we just disagree on the nature of people. What you're doing is the
same thing that a whole bunch of other people have done, which is trying to influence demand.
No. What I'm talking about also influences supply, because people are going to want to build better housing.
People want to build. Believe me, developers are desperate to build today.
It doesn't matter. The costs are insane anyways.
The problem that we have in the economy today is it takes you 3 to 5 years, if not longer, to get approval.
The problem we have in the economy today is over 70% of Canadians are spending more than 50% of their income on rent and house and mortgage.
That's because of supply.
That's because of the entire system. There is way more than just supply to that. Are you kidding?
No, what you're doing
telling me that housing speculation has nothing to do with this. That foreign ownership and money laundering has nothing to do with this.
What you're doing is the same thing that Soviet Russia did, which is give people money
for housing. I'm not giving money.
It's not demand, it's the problem. Supply is the problem. I am not
giving money to the person who is the resident, and I am not having the state own the property. That is completely different. This is not communism. This is capitalism.
No, it's not capitalism, because
it is definitely capitalism.
No, what you're doing is you're saying that if I give people some more money, whether it's directly or indirectly, I'm going to magically create the supply to solve them. And the problem is that the magic supply doesn't exist, because we've tried it. We've tried tripling housing prices. We've tried tripling rental prices. We have the lowest vacancy rate in history, and still we don't have enough supply. And the reason why
the lowest vacancy rate in history compared to what
we've had in history, we have our vacancy rate is less than 1% right now.
In
Toronto, people are desperate. People are desperate for housing.
Are we counting all the refugees and the homeless?
No, and if you did that, frankly, your vacancy rate would be,
So
zero.
You have the lowest vacancy rate when you don't count all the people who don't have homes. That sounds like a pretty garbage statistic.
We have the vacancy rate is based on the percentage of supply that is vacant, not on, again, you're far more focused on supply. It's not based on how much demand is not met. We have probably one of the most over demand situations we ever have. We have a situation where governments put in development fees of 100 to $115,000 for every unit that you want to build. We have a federal government that puts on a GST and HST on new homes. We have driven up the price of building a home by making it 3 to 5 years to build it, by going through a bunch of red tape and hoops, by having community meetings and planning regulatory discussions and approval processes that are greater and more extensive than any other sector of our industry, making it very difficult to bring supply to the marketplace.
I don't disagree with any of that.
We don't have enough supply.
I don't disagree with any of that. And as I've said previously in this conversation and in things I've written, we have supply issues, right? I've said that. I've also said that what I'm talking about creates a invisible hand of the market organic force that increases supply. Now, we disagree on that. I think there are two important questions.
Increase supply. It increases demand, because what you're doing is you're giving homeless people money that they can effectively
I'm not giving homeless people money.
You're giving landlords that homeless people money, which I think is a brilliant idea. And I think that makes sense. And you're giving people that house refugees money, which I think is a brilliant idea, but it doesn't solve the supply issue.
There's two questions, I think, that need to be answered here. Not necessarily by us, but just generally need to be answered. The first is shelter a right or a commodity? And if that's on a spectrum, where is it on the spectrum? And I think that is a very important question we need to wrestle with as a culture. The second, and I'm not sure about the answer to that. And I think the things that I would propose would depend on where that things fall on that spectrum. And I think actually, what are your thoughts on that? Let's explore that for a sec. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that it is a travesty that we as a society don't have housing for all. And I do think that housing should be a right. I think that you don't have a right to a mansion. You don't have a right to a two-bedroom house in suburbia with a pool. But I do think that our society is wealthy enough that there should not be people that are so destitute that are living on the street. And I think it is atrocious that we recruit people to our country. We promise them a great future. We promise them a great job. We incentivize them to move from wherever they are living to immigrate to Canada. And then they find themselves homeless in downtown Toronto because they can't afford something. And we've seen this, like crazy in the last couple of weeks with homeless people, refugees, protesting on city corners in downtown Toronto. And I firmly believe that the problem we've got is lack of supply, and
I agree.
And demand is there. I do like your idea a lot of having the money go directly from the government to the landowners. I wouldn't do it for everyone. I would do it for those people at the lower end of the spectrum, the income spectrum. And
there's not enough incentive for private landowners to get into the system that way.
No, I think there is. I think there is. So inclusionary zoning has been a big issue in the last couple of years.
It has to be a very big number. It has to be over 1,000. Very big number.
Inclusionary zoning is a big issue in the province of Ontario and the city of Toronto the last couple of years. And again, studies have been done. 18 out of 20 cities in North America that have put in place inclusionary zoning have incentivized developers to provide that inclusionary zoning by giving them an incentive, by increasing density, by increasing height, by doing something such that they can make a whole bunch more money in some other way, such that they have the incentive to provide 10% or 20% of their housing at below market rates for social housing. Toronto and Portland are the only two communities in all of North America that have not done that. And so what we've got is we've got a system where we have got municipal governments that think that they can put the taxes on developers and think that that is going to effectively provide the housing for everyone else. But what they don't realize is that it's not the rich developers that they keep saying are going to be providing it. What they do, the developers are going to make the same amount of money as they did before. What they're going to do is they're going to pass on that tax, whether it be this tax or development fees or anything else that the municipal governments demand of them, onto their consumers. And so therefore it raises inaffordability for everyone else. And so
why do you care if you don't pay rent? Why would you care? If no residents pay rent and you decouple the market entirely, why would you care?
What you've got to do is you've got to create a situation where developers are willing, and or in your analysis, municipal governments, which today don't do it at all, but governments or private developers build housing. And today there is more than enough market incentive for them to build housing. We have huge market incentives.
Once again, though.
So the market incentives demand is not the problem. The problem is we have this massive red tape, this restrictions on supply.
Okay, philosophically, and once again, I get the supply point, but still, philosophically, if we have a spectrum from a right for shelter to commodity, and you're basically at the right side, then philosophically, people should not pay anything for housing. It should be free, period. And the system should facilitate that. If that's where someone is philosophically.
No, I think we have a right to drinking water.
If you have a right to shelter, you do not pay for it.
No, I disagree. Again, let me say, please let me finish. We have a right to clean drinking water. But if you want to have Perrier, you have to pay more. If you want to have that water made into tonic water and have it with a gin, you got to pay a lot more. So you can consume your water in a whole bunch of different ways. I think if it's just drinking water, you can get it. And that's why I'm saying you're trying to make it the same for everybody. And I think
no, I'm not, because you can privately own and you can choose to not rent your area out, have better square footage per person, get paid a stipend lower than what you would get paid if you housed people, and be richer. You can do that.
I don't think we need to, have the federal government give that rich landowner in Rosedale or Forest Hill or Mississauga or wherever that person is the stipend for that housing. But we do need to provide money's coming from the federal government or the provincial government or both for people at the lowest end of the income spectrum to ensure that they've got the money to.
When you separate that
housing
out and you don't create a race to the top in the market, you create situations where you have public housing or very low cost private housing where where the elderly are dying in heat waves because they don't fix the AC. When you create a market where people have maximum mobility and they simply can leave, then they leave.
And we have universal health care, and we still have
universal health insurance. We both agree on that.
And we end up having problems with that. We have universality in education, and yet, as you know as well as I do, that people go to private school or else they go to a public school in a better neighborhood, or they go to a public school where the teachers end up having fares to get more money, to have extra activities, etc. And so universality is not the solution for us.
No, but if we had a market where people were able to be more mobile, then they could leave the areas that didn't treat them well, and those areas would fail until they fixed it. You're using capitalist market forces and letting the buyer choose who fails and who succeeds because the buyer is able to be mobile. That is fundamental to the entire idea, which is why I'm so stressing on the idea of that this rate be the same everywhere. Because if you have variable rates, it doesn't work. They're not mobile. If it's somewhere and not other places, it doesn't work because the private sector simply charges more and says, I'm not going to do it.
What's going to happen is you're going to have a whole bunch of housing built in areas that don't make sense because they're going to be far away from the jobs, and that's going to be because land is cheaper.
They will make sense.
You've got to have
no. They will make sense so long as people are willing to live there. If you are willing to live there instead of where you were living before, then it made sense for you. Okay, that's the point.
But land in Toronto is order of magnitude more expensive than land in Owen Sound.
Yes, which is why people will accept living in greater density. And some people will say, you know what? I'm not paying rent. I can get a different job where I'm working remotely.
That's happening today. That's happening today, where you're paying $1,500 to $2,000 a square foot versus
their cost of living is too high. Their cost of living is too high. They can't afford to move. They're not mobile enough. People right now in Toronto are putting up with 2-hour commutes to do what would normally be a 30-minute drive because they're not mobile. There are so many problems that you potentially could, once again, this is theoretical. I want it to be researched. I'm not saying we do it right away. There are so many problems that you could potentially fix if you just increase the mobility of residents.
Well, I think that we've tried to increase the mobility of residents through better transit, but that's a whole separate story.
No. I'm talking about being able to move. Don't change the topic, Brian.
People move.
No, they don't. Come on.
No,
they're not like this. We're talking about a market where you can move anywhere because there's no rental or mortgage cost. Come on.
No, we had one of the biggest moves in history during COVID-19, where people left downtown Toronto and moved to 905, 519, etc. And now they're moving back. And as you probably have seen article after article, cottage country is crashing today in real estate pricing because a lot of those people that had moved out to cottage country during COVID-19 for remote work are now moving back.
I think you're talking about a very small demographic.
No, I'm not. I think that they're, London, Kitchener, Brantford, Hamilton were on fire during COVID-19 as people moved out of the city of Toronto, and now they're moving back because they're no longer working remotely. They're working in a hybrid and or working full time, and gas has gone gas has become more expensive as well. And so therefore, when you combine housing plus transportation costs, it costs a lot more today to live in a suburban environment. And so therefore, the demand for closer in housing has gone up. Anyway, we got to take another break. Final one, and come back with Alex Vezina and some closing comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Alex Vezina, a very smart gentleman, CEO of Prepared Canada, an emergency preparedness company. He writes articles, columns in the Toronto Sun, every week. And he's written 2 articles about a radical idea for housing. I disagree with his idea generally, but I do think it makes a lot of sense for people at the lower end of the income spectrum. But, I think that what Alex has done, which I think a lot of people have done in the last little while, is they've attacked the demand side of the housing crisis equation and thought that demand is the potential solution. And I fundamentally believe that supply and lack of supply and government red tape and regulation that has impacted negatively supply is the issue. And so, Alex, I'm going to send you a couple of articles. I'm going to send you a couple of links. I'm going to send you some of the stories that I've had the honor of hosting on my radio show in the last little while. And I want to have this debate again. I want to have part two, Alex and Brian talking about the solutions here, because I want to suggest to you that what you're suggesting for maybe the bottom 10 or 20% of the income spectrum makes a ton of sense. But what I'm suggesting makes sense for the 80% of the balance of the income spectrum, which is dramatic increases in supply by dramatic reductions in government red tape and regulation and time to get approval.
So I'm not arguing that the ideas are mutually exclusive, though. And I would also make the argument, as I have, that my proposal here does also affect supply. Now, we have some disagreement on its effect of supply, and I think we have some disagreement on the effect on market mobility. And this is 10 economists in a room debating this for 3 years. Okay, this is gonna take a bit to work out, and we're gonna have fundamental disagreements, and that's fine. But I don't think really that I've attacked this and said this is only a demand problem. I would agree that this does affect demand, at least initially, more than supply. But I've also said multiple times in our talk here that I agree that supply is likely the biggest issue in the whole thing. However, there's a lot more going into this, right? There's a lot more little parts to this. And my fundamental argument with all of this really is not that we should implement what I'm saying right away, but at minimum, we should look into it significantly, like academically at least, like look into it, give it some serious thought, and either maybe it works on its own, maybe parts of it work, maybe, who knows. But look, I'm not approaching this like a radical saying that we should just implement it now because reasons before due diligence is done. I'm saying we should do some due diligence, which I think is reasonable when someone has an idea in the shower and then member checks it against some experts that they know.
Well, Alex, you're one of the smartest young men I know. And so any idea you come up with is worth giving some intense thought to. I do think that what you're suggesting makes a ton of sense at the lower end of the income spectrum. And so let's talk about it again.
As a little aside, just because we don't normally get this heated, I'd like to thank you for having so much fun, because I know that you did. Because we don't normally get this heated with each other, but I'm sure it was entertaining for everybody. Yeah, so this one was fun. And yeah, so you'll send me that, and then we'll both do some deep dives on some stuff, and yeah, we'll do this again.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. Good night. Thanks, Alex.